Right, good afternoon, everyone. I will get started in the meantime. Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Massimo Guida, and I'm a Toronto-based composer who is currently serving as an Ontario councillor with the CLC. This is my first year with the CLC, and this is also my first time hosting a webinar. Firstly, as I know that we have many people joining us from many different places today, I would like us all to take a moment to acknowledge where we are. As I am joining you from Toronto, I would like to acknowledge the land on which I am meeting with you is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would also like to remind those of us who, like me, are settlers, that as uninvited guests on these lands, we each share the responsibility to learn more about the people who first lived on these lands, as well as about the terrible consequences of colonialism. We must also take steps toward addressing issues of colonialism and systemic racism in our own everyday lives. The CLC also recognizes that decolonization must be an active and ongoing process of reconciliation. This is an issue that we at the CLC are actively pursuing, while simultaneously recognizing that much of the work still has to be done in this area. I would now like to introduce the Canadian League of Composers, or CLC. Our organization speaks for the interests of Canadian composers, and our website can be found at www.composition.org. We offer professional development opportunities and resources to members, and we use advocacy and partnerships to foster an environment in which Canadian art music is highly valued. Thank you to the Ontario Arts Council, the Canadian Council for the Arts, the SOCAN Foundation, the Israeli Foundation for their financial support, and for allowing us to give these series of webinars. I will now introduce our presenter today, Saman Shahi. Saman is an award-winning and published composer, pianist, conductor, and educator based in Toronto. He's an affiliate member of the Canadian League of Composers, Canadian Music Centre, and SOCAN. His compositions have been performed in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. He is the music director of the Peterborough Concert Band, and as a pianist, he performs with his violin duo, the Rogue Duo, and the Circle Music Band. He works with the Canadian Opera Company as lead artist for their after-school opera program. He is also the executive director and a co-founder at Iranian Canadian Composers of Toronto, or ICOT, an old art organization based in Toronto since 2011. I just wanted to remind you to feel free to submit any questions that you would like to ask Saman, either in this chat on Zoom or through the comment section on the Facebook page. We'll be monitoring these and we will make sure to ask them to Saman. The questions can be either in English or French. I will now hand things over to Saman, who will be discussing advice for grant writing in today's webinar. This session includes participants to major granting bodies, federally and provincially, as well as the grant types they offer. And we will delve into the basics of grant writing and budgeting and explore some grant writing common pitfalls.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. Thanks to the CLC for having me. It's great to have an opportunity to connect with all of the wonderful colleagues from across Canada today. Before I start, I just wanted to add a quick disclaimer that since this is a sort of an overall look at grant writing and how grants work, there might be a lot of information for some semi-experienced grant writers that might be sort of very basic, and there might be other folks who are just starting out and haven't written a grant before. So sort of bear with me. There might be some information that some of you might already be very familiar with, but we're going to go through all of it. And there's a lot of details we're gonna cover today. And at the end of the session, I believe that the presentation file is also going to be able to be shared with all of you. So I'm just going to go ahead and share this with you. Massimo, is this okay? Is this looking okay? All right.
Yep, we can see everything.
Beautiful. Okay. All right, let's just move this way. So just as a very first step to understanding what a grant is basically a non-repayable fund or product that's dispersed usually by a government department to either an organization or an artist for a project or for previous achievements as in the form of an award, basically. I just thought I put that out there. Sometimes there's confusion about grants. Some people actually think you have to pay it back. It's non-repayable, but there's always some form of an application form or like a proposal involved that you have to involve yourself with, and then you would be considered for that grant. So that's just a really quick understanding of what we're talking about today. In Canada, a lot of artists and organizations rely on government and also private foundations to provide them funding and resources for their activities. These resources, I have sort of split them up into groups of sort of federal, provincial, and municipal, and also the private foundations that sort of benefit all of Canadian artists. At the federal level, we have the Canada Council for the Arts, which is probably the most important federally funding agency for all artists and organizations. We also have Canadian Heritage and Canada Music Fund that are sort of the grandfathers of the Canada Council and all the other provincial and municipal councils that operate within Canada. We also have the SOCAN Foundation that is a subsidiary of the SOCAN, which is the Society of Composers, Authors, and Music Publishers, that deals with royalties and licensing fees. And SOCAN Foundation also has some grants. They're not as major as the other sort of granting bodies, but they're still very, very important, and they get used a lot. And then we get to the provincial and the municipal level, where each province would have its own arts council, and also would also have the office of the province also disperse some funding for certain projects, and also the municipal level, where, let's say, the city of Montreal or the Toronto Arts Council or the Essex Region Arts Council. So there are either certain regions or certain major cities that would have their own arts councils. And then we have the private foundations. Now, these private foundations, some of them are heavily overseen by the government, and they operate within certain boundaries of government determination, such as Factor. Factor is the foundation assisting Canadian talent on recordings. They exclusively give grants for recording sessions, touring, traveling, or artist sort of professional development for artists that are aspiring to be recording artists. And we have a few others, such as the Israeli Foundation or the 4CS Foundation. These are fully private foundations that do a lot of grant giving and sort of fundraising for arts and science and all sorts of things. So these are the sort of the major players. Obviously, for provincial, municipal, I couldn't list everything because we have many provinces, many cities, and many regions. So if you live somewhere outside of Ontario, where I live, you would have different government bodies and agencies that would provide funds for you, and you probably are aware of them, or with a quick search, you can get to know who they are and what they do and what kinds of projects they offer and they fund. Now, if we look at grant types, there are two ways of sort of categorizing what kinds of grants are usually given out, and this is not an exhaustive list. Obviously, there's probably grants that I have not included here, but as far as music and as far as the arts are concerned, we have project grants and creation commissioning grants, recording, travel, professional development, initiative grants, and operation grants. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about each of them. So project grants basically are given to either individuals, organizations, or groups and ensembles or ad hoc groups, and they fund a musical or let's say an artistic endeavor that has multiple moving parts. Let's say you're putting on a production of some sort, you're putting on a ballet or an opera or a play, where there are multiple things happening: the creation, the preparation, the presentation, all of that. So the project grants are very important for a lot of organizations and individuals because they would need sort of customized funding, and these project grants are usually very flexible in terms of what they fund. So they're not just particular to one type of activity. They are quite flexible. And And also just to explain what an ad hoc group is, because I know some people don't know what it is. An ad hoc group is an informal organization. So basically, when a group of people come together as a collective and decide to work together, but they're not incorporated as a nonprofit or as a business, they are considered basically an ad hoc group. And also, there was one of the questions that asked about whether or not businesses can apply for grants, and I just want to get that out of the way right away. So when we talk about organizations, we're referring to nonprofit organizations and not businesses, because businesses are for profits, and there are other resources for them from the governments and municipalities to provide them with support. So if you have an incorporated business, even a music business, that you cannot apply for grants through that business. It would have to be through yourself or nonprofit. We have the second one. We have a creation or commissioning grant. That's where an individual is deciding to create a work from scratch, or is asking somebody to create a work for them for a particular event or purpose. Again, applicable to individuals, ensembles, or organizations. We have recording grants, again, to all of the above. That's self-explanatory. That's where, going to a studio and recording a project, and all of its, all the costs that are sort of related to it. And then we have travel and touring, which, again, self-explanatory. Then we get to professional development grants that a lot of these councils give away as well. That's for individuals or sometimes ensembles that want to focus on a particular, either they want to do some research on a particular kind of artistic practice, or they want to sort of spend some time in the studio or at home practicing or sharpening their skills, or they want to attend a seminar or workshop or a course abroad or in Canada. So a lot of these professional development grants focus on the individual or a group of closely involved individuals, like an ensemble, and their sort of better sort of their improvement as a group or as a person, artistically as speaking. We also have initiative grants. Initiative grants sort of come out of the socioeconomical needs of the day, and they are usually programmed by the government based on what is happening during that time. For instance, a few years back, we were dealing with the refugee crisis all around the globe, and then therefore the government of Canada mandated a lot of funds and grants to be given out to either refugee artists or refugee or organizations that were working with refugees. So, that was an example of a refugee, an initiative grant, and they just spring up based on what the need is, and so you would have to kind of be constantly on the lookout for them. We have operation grants that are applicable to organizations or ensembles, and it's a very important resource for, and I would say even for the livelihood of a lot of these organizations and ensembles in Canada. They usually come in a single year or multi-year tiers, which means they would have guaranteed funding for, let's say, 3 or 5 years, depending on their operations and their costs and their staff and all of that. And a lot of the organizations count on these funds to survive, and that's one of the challenges they're facing these days as the pandemic is happening. We also have a few grants concerning things like marketing, publicity, or administrative stuff. Let's say you have an organization that wants to sort of rebrand itself or bring itself back up or do an overhaul administratively. There are a few grants that sort of fund that and give resources to organizations and ensembles to make that happen. Now, if you want to look at another way to divide how grants operate, is whether a grant is arts form specific or if it's inter-arts or multimedia. So if, for example, if it only markets, if it only is sort of attracting music proposals or theater proposals versus if it sort of is all encompassing, right? And this second one is the same way, purpose specific grants that are just more for one thing, for recording or for creation, as opposed to all encompassing, which is from the ground up, it covers all of the expenses or all forms of expenses of a project. The Canada Council for the Arts has moved towards both of the latter options in the past few years with their new pillars. They are encouraging artists of all genres and practice and styles to work together, and that's why we have a lot more grants that sort of don't concern themselves with only one art form or one genre or one type of activity, but they fund the entire process from its conception to its presentation of any sort, whether it's a recording or a public performance or broadcasting. And those are great, and I encourage everybody to check those out because that's a fairly new thing. It's in the past few years where the county council has done that, done this just, you know, a fundamental shift in their policy, in their funding policy. So these are the major grant types that sort of exist out there. Let me see, sometimes this thing is not working. Okay, there we go. So let's say you want to apply for a grant and you don't know where to start. Before even putting the pen down to paper or, you know, start typing away at your proposal, there are a few things you have to absolutely consider, and that is concerned with the guidelines of the grant. So you would want to either download it or view it on your computer and really study it. So in the guidelines, there's usually things such as eligibility or the scope of the grant, or how much it is, what the deadline is, what kinds of documents are needed. All of these things are listed in that grant guideline. And you need to really carefully state that, because the last thing you would want is to spend hours and hours writing a grant and just at the end realize that you're for some reason not eligible, or your project doesn't qualify, or one of the major costs that you were sort of concerned with doesn't qualify for the grant. So that's the grant scope, its purpose, and its funding limit. So some grants, for instance, only fund a maximum of 30% of your total budget costs. For instance, if you have a project that's $30,000, that grant is not going to go beyond $10,000 because they want you to go. So you have to kind of find all of that out, and it's easily sort of accessible through the guidelines. Eligibility is a very important thing. Sometimes applicants are not eligible for a variety of reasons, whether it's geographical, whether it's previous awards or grants that they've won that sort of disqualifies them from applying for that particular grant, whether it's age or there's a variety of different things. So you really need to also check the eligibility, also the eligibility of costs, right? So you need to see what kinds of costs you can basically claim for this particular grant. Some costs may not be eligible, and then you just want to be sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. Required documents are also very important. Sometimes you might need letters of endorsement or letters of support, or certain documentations that might take time. So you need to also take time to acquire. So you need to make sure that you also know what those are before you start applying. And if anything is not making sense or is not clear, you can obviously always ask friends and peers and colleagues, but the best way to do it is to give yourself some time and actually contact the grant officer. So every grant or a granting program has a person or two that are in charge of administering that grant, from answering the questions all the way to administrating the deliberation, the assessment, and also contacting the successful and successful applicants. I would probably email them, though you can call grant officers, but email is usually faster and a little bit more sort of easy because it's right in front of them. And even if it takes them a few days to respond, they usually get back to you. But phone is a little bit more challenging, especially given the volume that they have to deal with on a daily basis. So grant officers are your best friends. Don't be shy to contact them. They love hearing from you, and it would also be good for them to know your project before you apply, because it gives them a chance to sort of get to know you as a person and also your project. So definitely give them a call or send them an email before you start applying. So in any grant application, you would have certain typical sections that you kind of go through. Again, not all grant applications have all of these, but definitely some of these are included in every application. So there's the artist profile, where you sort of talk about yourself, who you are, what you do. Your project description, where you talk about sort of an in-depth explanation of what you're trying to do and how you're going to do it. There's usually a section or a couple of questions on the impact of your project on either yourself or your group or your community that you're dealing with, or your art form. So that's also a really important question that you always have to sort of have in mind, that what your project's going to do and how it's going to impact its surroundings. And there's usually budget where, you're talking about money and how much things cost and how much money you have and how much money you need. And then you have support material where you're just sending in, either documents that validate your project that are required, or material from your work, let's say an audio file or video file, all of that. And if you're successful, you would have to do a final report after the completion of the grant, where you'd explain how the money was spent and how the budgeting worked out, and also talk about how the grant was helpful. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly go through each of these and talk about what each section does and how to best optimize writing for each section, and then we'll go from there. So, but before we go there, there's also typical concepts that jurors use to assess your application. Again, this is not a universal global thing, but it would be similar enough. The first thing that they usually look at for your application, these are sort of the marking schemes, the scoring schemes, is the merit of the project. Meaning, is it thought-provoking? Is it innovative? Is it socially or artistically significant? Is it, interesting in any way? Are the people you're working with, the personnel or artistic people that you're working with, are they bringing anything to the table that's very sort of groundbreaking? So that's the merit of the project. Generally speaking, just talking about they would be marking your the parameters of the project and how interesting or captivating it is. And then the impact is the second marking scheme that's usually used, which is how is affecting you as an artist in your current stance and circumstance in your artistic practice, in your career. Is it going to move you forward? Are you exploring things, or are you sort of trying to further your artistic practice? Also, are you, reaching new audiences? Are you reaching beyond your normal, usual community, or are you sort of increasing your exposure within the already existing fan base? Again, no right or wrong. It's just this is the section where you would have to talk about that and justify why in this particular project that's the impact. And then the viability, which is essentially, is this doable, or how doable is it? In its most ambitious form, is the timeline realistic? Is the budget realistic? Is the total project scale manageable, or is it too much, or is it very manageable? And usually here you would have to sort of profile some of your past experiences in management of projects and stuff. Even if you don't have it, you can sort of, I don't know, you can say that this would be your first project. So it's an experience, and it's an adventure. So these are the marking schemes that are usually used for assessing your application. Again, not a global thing, but it would be along the same lines. So you also might want to think about these things as you're writing your grant. So in your artist profile, and again, just to give you an idea, I've been pretty successful at getting grants as an applicant, but I've also been sort of sitting on a lot of juries as a grant assessor, as a juror. And so a lot of the experience that I'm going to share with you today is from the other side, where I would have to sort of read through these things and some of the reactions I would have, or some of the reactions my colleagues would have, just to sort of give you an idea of the other side of the game and how things work out on the other end. So language that's usually very abstract and very sort of ungraspable tends to sort of disconnect the reader from your text. It's always good that you are sort of very clearly stating what your artistic practice is, what your aspirations are, what your influences are, what sort of informs your work as an artist, and what you want to, where you want to be, your aspirations, your sort of goals, your objectives. When those are clearly stated, it's very interesting to read. And far too many times when you're reading a bio or an artist profile, you see information that's irrelevant. For instance, year and place of birth. Again, and unless it's really, really important to who you are as an artist, or a lot of name dropping, you see a lot of that in artist profiles. People, naming every single composition teacher they had. Nobody's gonna remember all that unless it's like, Christoph Penderecki. nobody's going to remember, right? So you need to make sure that you're optimizing the information that you're presenting, because the volume doesn't necessarily mean quality, right? Or other information that's not easily memorable, such as, again, dates, names, unless it was a project or it was a person that really meant a lot to you, or to who you are as an artist or as a person that you want to mention it. But populating your application with it is just going to tire the eye, and the brain's just going to disengage. Again, so focus on your aspirations and achievements more than and be very clear and sort of concrete in your language. And make sure that you're showing your career as a more or less a straight line, and this is a very, very important thing. Like, even though nobody's career is ever a straight line, as in any, I don't think in any career, especially in arts, but you want to at least kind of make the illusion that it is, and then you're kind of moving along this line, and all the projects that you're doing are thought through and are sort of considered to get you from this point to the next point, and this point to the next one, closer to where you envision yourself as an artist. So you want to sort of have that at the core of your artist profile, that you're showing that there's a narrative, right? That there's a logical narrative to the way you're moving through your career, even though inside you probably know that there's a lot of ups and downs and setbacks, and I mean, setbacks as big of a pandemic, you know. So these things are important in the eye of the reader. They sort of perceive your application, perceive your achievements very, very differently. And another thing that can really, really help is that if you mention certain things that would later on tie to your project. So, for instance, you say, I'm really interested in exploring music of such and such, and then later on in your project description, the next section, you're talking about how this thing that you're doing has to do with that influence that you were talking about. So create some sort of connection and tie-in. So this is not some independent thing from your project description, and there's some sort of organic connection. I think that's also a very, very important thing, that to make some form of connection between who you are and what you're trying to do. Now, online presence, also very important, not mandatory. There are a lot of really high profile artists that don't even have social media or websites. But it's really important to know that having an outdated website or social media is probably worse than not having one, especially when it comes to websites. It makes a much worse impression to not have one than to have an outdated one. So make sure that if you have a website, it's at least, biannually updated. And if you don't have that capacity, you take it down and make sure that you sort of have the resources to make that happen. It's very, very important that your website is, whenever you go to somebody's website and it's updated 3 years ago, it doesn't resonate very well, right? So that's a very, very important thing. Also, if it's asked to provide your website or social media handles, make sure that they're somewhat reasonably updated. Then we get to the project description. So this is a section that's designed to explain what your project is, what the timeline is, the process, key artists and personnel, and all of that. So every single detail. So after the jury reads this section of your proposal, they need to have a more or less clear picture of what you're trying to do. And also, one of the most important questions that's always asked is, well, a lot of things might change because, you're applying for this and you might be doing this project in 6 months. So, people might change, or times and dates and venues. It is understood that a lot of these details might change from the moment that you're writing it. So knowing that, what you're putting out there is final, but then if things change, obviously there's flexibility on all ends. So you can make that change. One of the most important things about project descriptions is know your own project. And that might sound silly, but if you can't summarize your project in 2 to 4 sentences, you might not know it. And a lot of times we read proposals from applicants, and there are so many moving parts, and there's so much going on that it doesn't sound like the applicant even knows what's going to be the final product or process. So make sure that you know your project very, very well, and you can summarize it, and you can concretely and simply actually explain what is happening. Whenever possible, use point form. And again, this has to do with the attention span of whoever's reading it and has to mark it and score it. Point forms are great for listing things such as, people or dates or venues or anything that is a number, a number of items that need to be sort of quickly skimmed through, as opposed to using sentence forms, which is going to take much more energy and much more sort of focus to understand and read. And in sections where you're writing text, make sure that you use paragraphs and you indent those paragraphs so then the eye visually can see that, okay, so there's the next section, and there's this section, there's this section, so that there's a division and there's a structure to the way you're writing. Again, your entire project description might be 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs. But then if in each paragraph you're talking about a particular part of the process, or the first part, the more philosophical part of it, and the second part is more timeline, and the third part is your team, then there's like a form, sort of like a form or structure or a flow to the way you're writing, and that really, really helps. So make sure that your content is very, very structured. There's nothing worse than just seeing a big block of text where the applicant's just jumping from point to point without really a coherent narrative throughout it. You're trying to get a grip on what this proposal is trying to do, and that really doesn't help. And know the grant scope. So know what this grant funds, how much it funds, and what aspects of your project it funds. If you're in your project description, you're talking about paying for, I don't know, your composer, and this is a recording grant where commissions are not, not covered, then it makes you sound like you haven't done your research, you haven't done your homework. So make sure that you know that this grant covers A and B and C, and to this degree and to this percentage, and mention that so that the jury knows exactly that you have a game plan and you're following that game plan. Oftentimes there's a separate section for project planning, where you have to kind of list what is happening with whom and when. And for this part, definitely use point form, and definitely use chronological order, and definitely use some form of a chart. I can give you an example here. So, and again, not all grant applications allow you to have a chart like this. Some do, some don't, but you can sort of still follow the same sort of format. So if you can look at this, you'll see that I have a chart that is listing the timeline, what is happening, in a larger timeline, and what the sort of the interval dates are, and in each interval date, what is happening, what the activity is, with whom, who's involved, and what they're doing, and what the goal is. And so, sort of, if the juror looks at this for, I don't know, 10 seconds, they can get a pretty clear picture of what is happening. Or this for a recording project, for instance. Okay, so rehearsals, and the recording, and then the editing, and then they're doing the designs. Okay, so they're releasing on December 1st. Done. Next. As opposed to using sentences. Can you imagine if you use sentences for something like this, it would take so much more energy to read it. And this is also much more organized, and it puts things in a really clear perspective. So definitely use something like this to explain your plan and the process of your project happening. The next section, and again, some grants have it as a separate section, or some have it as a couple of questions, is impact. And the point is to sort of illustrate here that your project would have an impact on you as an artist, or sort of take you further in your career, or maybe you're sort of exploring very different art forms and art practices, and this project's enabling you to do that. Or maybe that it is reaching beyond your regular fan base, and you're sort of reaching out to other communities or other peoples or other fans that may not be exposed to you necessarily, and you want to be able to do that. And those are all very viable and good things. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. One of the things that arts councils really like is a combination of innovation and connection. So when you have art that's groundbreaking or exploratory, and it's trying to sort of understand things and find connections and all that, and also an art that tries to go beyond its normal scope of audiences and tries to reach other folks, especially when it comes to the larger councils, let's say the County Council, Ontario Arts Council, or let's say Manitoba Arts Council. They want artists to go beyond their communities and reach other people Now, this could be in terms of ethnicity. This could be in terms of subjective taste. Like, let's say, what group of people that listen to, heavy metal might be interested in what you're doing as a classical artist or something like that. So creating that connection is very, very important. And if you can show that in your applications, usually it receives a higher score, because it sort of illustrates your effort in trying to make a connection with people that you didn't have that connection before. The other thing is what the effect of this particular project is on your career path as an artist. And again, like we were talking about it before, you want to create this, flow, seeming flow that in your career path, that you're sort of moving from point A to point B, and this is where you want to be, and how this project is contributing to that goal and to reaching that goal. Is it sort of a moment where you want to stop and explore other things, on the side, or is the moment where you really want to use all of your resources on this one project and really increase your exposure? What is happening, right? So that's a very important aspect of the impact section we want to talk about. And again, not one or the other. You want to just be clear and be very honest about what your goals are and how this project is contributing you reaching those goals, and how it's contributing to your exposure, and how it's contributing to your art form and your development as an artist. So these are all things that are discussed here. Another thing that's quite important, and especially given the climate, in the socio-political climate of the day, I think it's about diversity and representation. So if your project is informed by arts and art practices or cultures that are underrepresented, that are in any form of minority or oppressed peoples, or indigenous peoples, or any group of people that are underrepresented in the current sort of milieu of our social structure, that you want to mention that and make it highlight that, make a big point of it, because that is very important. Also, if you or any people in your team are sort of from minority groups or from underrepresented groups, you also want to make sure that that's very, very clearly stated. Or if the communities that you're trying to reach are also from the underrepresented groups, again, you want to make sure that that's very much highlighted, because that will give you a better stance in terms of the connection point that we were making earlier, that you're trying to reach other folks. So that's the impact section. It's quite an important section. And then we get to budgeting. And I know by now, if somebody amongst you hasn't written a grant before, they're probably overwhelmed. And it's totally normal to be overwhelmed, but I can assure you that once you do this a couple of times, it's actually a lot easier and simpler than it looks. So don't worry, we'll get you there. So budgeting is essentially where you talk about money, right? What you have and how much things cost and how much you need. And also you're talking about how much you're asking for this particular grant. And it's important. And there's oftentimes required for you to submit a budget breakdown where you show how the larger or more complicated numbers, such as certain fees or salaries, are calculated, and you kind of have to show that. So as we talked about it before, certain certain grants only cover up to a certain percentage or amount of the total cost, or generally speaking. Sometimes 30%, sometimes 50%. Sometimes if it's an all-encompassing project, all-encompassing grant, it covers the entire cost structure of a grant. So you have to kind of study that beforehand and make sure that you know how much you're asking for them. So if your entire project is costing $30,000 and that particular grant only covers 30% of it, then you can't ask for more than $10,000, right? So you have to kind of know that going in. One of the most important thing in budgeting with councils is that they need to see that you have more than one source of revenue. So you have to diversify your revenue streams. It's so important that the council, that the jury, when they look at your budget, they see that you have the confidence of more than one person, first of all, and you're also not putting all your eggs in one basket. So if this particular grant doesn't come through, then the project can't happen, right? They want to see that you have at least some effort in terms of pending or confirmed funds from other arts councils, federal, provincial, municipal, or maybe you have some form of a individual donation or corporate sponsorship or anything, crowdfunding, any form of revenue streams that enable you to sort of move things back and forth should one of those amounts not come in. So this is very, very important. And oftentimes grant applications that only have one source of funding score very low because it's very high risk. You know, what if that amount doesn't come in? Then what's going to happen to the project? In your budget, you have to include all of the costs, regardless of whether or not they're eligible, because you're saying how much your project costs total and how much of it you are sort of getting from this grant based on what the eligible costs are, and how much of it you're getting from other sources based on, you know, so you might have a recording grant where the marketing money is coming from somewhere else, but the recording fees are coming from this grant, or let's say, you know, so different parts of the project might be funded through different means. This could be different other grants, or the federal grants, or other sort of private grants that are coming in. So that's also very important. I just want to make sure that I'm not losing any important points. Yeah, so, and in your budget breakdown, where you're sort of breaking down bigger numbers, you have to make sure that everything is in point form, just like the project plan that we were talking about before. Everything is very organized and sort of categorized so that the eye can sort of quickly scan the whole thing and understand what's happening. Grant application budgets need to always be based on industry numbers, industry sort of regulated fees and numbers and amounts. Even though sometimes these numbers seem very high, that's the number, those are the numbers that the jury expects to see. And if you know, let's say you don't get that grant amount, or if you have half that money, then you obviously can negotiate with your people or your venues and stuff and sort of reduce some of the costs. But you need to sort of, in your budget form, things need to be listed as the most ambitious sort of version of that project. So all the costs need to be industry based. For example, for composers, we have here at the CLC, we have rates for commissioning. So whenever we apply for a grant for commissioning or creation, we need to use that table. Even though I don't think almost never, no composer gets that amount of money, but at least that's the place to start, and then we can go from there. So that's also important. Even though they may seem high, those are the numbers that are expected to be there in terms of union regulated fees or sort of any sort of fees that are regulated by a body. And another section that in budgeting that's really important is the contingency plan. And I would say this is almost as important as the budgeting itself. And this means what you're going to do if enough money doesn't come in or no money comes in. How are you going to carry on with the project? Are you still going to go ahead? What are you going to cut? So it's oftentimes very, very important that you show determination in your project and show confidence in your project, and show that no matter what, the show will go on and the thing will happen, whatever that endeavor is. And you can show in a very sort of structured way, in maybe even different phases or different tiers or levels, what will be cut should, let's say, 20% of the money doesn't come in, then these costs would be reduced, or these costs would be sort of in-kind donations, which means just people sort of donating their services to you instead of charging you. So if you show that in a very structured way, then you're increasing the confidence of the jury in your project, in your sort of vision as an artist. So contingency plans are very, very important. Sometimes they're listed as contingency, or sometimes it's just a question of saying, let's say we don't give you this grant, what are you going to do? Are you going to be able to carry this through? So make sure that you really think about how you're going to reduce costs, and how you're going to sort of misplace costs so that the project can happen, and what are the non-negotiable aspects of your project, right? What parts of your project are you not going to compromise on in terms of quality, or in terms of amount, or in terms of whatever, right? So those are the things you always want to stick to, right? This is the central part of my project, and I do not want to in any way accommodate any sort of flexibility on it, but here are the other aspects where I can move around and reduce or bring in other people. I'm just in this section, I'm just sort of showing you revenue sources. So these are pretty self-explanatory. Sort of, you know, donations or sponsorships, any form of sales or licensing. So whether it's merchandise, tickets, or any sort of admission fee. If you're doing any fundraising, or if you have any other grants or bursaries or awards that are going towards that project, those are all revenue sources. If you have a grant from Factor, and if you have personal savings, I would leave personal savings the very, very last, as a very last resort, just because, you know, you want to make sure that your project has enough merit and vision that it can carry itself onwards. Then we have the expense sources that, you know, all sorts of salaries or licensing and copyright. You know, if you're using poetry that needs sort of copyright amounts to be paid, any form of travel, accommodation, or transportation, any sort of location costs, if it's a venue or a studio, any sort of rentals or purchases, let's say an equipment or an instrument, marketing, promotion, advertising, all of that are usually eligible expense sources, and all other things like photography, videography, any sort of translation or proofreading, or, you know, insurance, printing, all that. So these are all expenses you can think about, and probably more things that, you know, can pertain to a particular project. Here's an example of a budget breakdown. Again, if you look at this for 10 seconds, you can quickly go through it and see, okay, so artist fees and, you know, travel expenses, production fees, these are all categorized. Each individual's full amount is written, and then in parentheses you see, okay, so this number of days times the fee for that day, or per hour, or whatever. So, and then there's a subtotal. Again, everybody might do this differently, but I would personally find this a very helpful format. If I looked at this, I can immediately grasp what's happening, and so can the jury, and then that, you know, that can sort of streamline the process and make the whole thing much faster and better. So before we go to support material, and we're kind of getting just past the half point here, Massimo, I'm wondering if there are any questions that I need to.
Thank you. Yes. So one of the questions we received was someone who wanted to ask which grants will be best suited for composers who are looking to have a piece of theirs performed.
Yeah. Okay, so that would be, there are different ways you can do that. Obviously, creation grants are really, or professional development grants are always really good venue for that, because you have, first of all, you have full creative control, where you can apply for a particular grant, write what you want to do, explain what you want to do, and explore, let's say, a particular art form or whatever, and ask for all the expenses that are related to it. And also in your budget, if it's eligible, ask for sort of either presentation or recording of it. So as I said, Canada Council for the Arts, the concept and realization grants are very, very good for that, because they cover all expenses related to your project. I live in Ontario, so I only know the Ontario Arts Council, and let's say the Toronto Arts Council, for instance. Toronto Arts Council has creation grants that, you know, fund you for creating a piece. They do not offer any money for presenting it or performing it. But, you know, obviously, if you have some leftover money, maybe you can later on use it for that, or you can just apply for a presenter producer grant from the Ontario Arts Council, for instance, to stage it. Professional development grants are also very good if you frame it in a way that this particular piece that you're trying to write as a composer is either very important or very sort of exploratory. So you're trying to have some designated time and space. And then you want to also present it to the public, so that could also be sort of formatted into your budgeting and your project description as part of the plan. But I would say the concept to realization grants from the Canada Council are probably best suited for something like that, because from the ground up they cover everything, and they're fairly generous with how much they give and how much of the project they fund.
Thank you. And then I think you had covered already, talking about, you had mentioned whether, I guess, like a business can apply for them. There was someone who was wondering if they could apply as a music production company. Another question was, are detailed proposals better, or are more general proposals better? Which I think you've also partially covered, but.
Yeah, I kind of covered that. It depends. It depends where you're talking about and what you're talking about, right? Again, we were talking about how over philosophizing your project description sometimes can actually hurt you because the number of applications somebody has to read, the amount of text they have to go through, and the amount of information can actually be quite overwhelming. So if you're going too much into detail about what you want to do, so I would say somewhere in between. And I would say probably each section calls for a particular amount of and the kind of information. For instance, in the impact section, you can talk about why this project is really important to you as your growth, for your growth as an artist, as opposed to in your project description where you're talking about more concrete things. And also in your artist profile where you're talking about what you want to do and what your aspirations are. So I think they can be divided up as opposed to just being in one section. Also in terms of just how much you're describing your projects, I think that can be done very strategically without being too wordy, right? So if you're using very concise and very sort of succinct language, you can describe your project with in a very optimized way and really get the message across. So I would say you would have to be fairly strategic about it and make sure that you're getting the message across without too many words. Yeah. Great. So let's, and I will get to more questions at the end. I just want to get through everything. So support material, it's a very important part of sorry, I think somebody has their mute off. We're hearing some fun music. Anyways, is where you submit artwork examples in audio, written form, or video form. You also submit here letters of endorsement, letters of support, reviews, or extra support materials. For instance, a lot of grants ask for scores or the words in your work, like let's say the poetry. So they might be asking for things like that as well. But always they restrict the amount and the type of things you can submit. So you can't just submit everything you have. So you have to understand what the allowed quantity is. So let's say if they say the overall number of pages you can submit should not exceed 20, then don't submit 21 because the 21st page will not go through. Or your project won't even submit online because everything is electronic and the application scans itself to make sure that everything is good. So it won't even submit before you eliminate that 21st page. So that's very important. So what you can what and how much, and also in terms of storage, you can't say submit a video file more than 1 gigabyte, right? So make sure that those are the required amounts. Format is also very important, and format is probably even more important than the quantity because if they ask for MP3 files and you send a WAV file and they can't open it, then that's just a wasted support material. So make sure that you know what formats are used and asked for. They're usually the common formats, let's say PDF or document, Windows Media, or QuickTime or something like that. They're not really out there or sort of esoteric formats nobody has. They're usually the very common types, but make sure you follow them because sometimes they ask for very specific things. Triple check your links and all of your material, especially your links, and especially links that have passwords. Sometimes you click on an applicant's link and it won't open, or it won't open and the password is incorrect, and that's just such a pity because then you've put so much work into it and it just won't go through and we can't hear your work. That would really suck. So make sure that your link works, your password works. The next comment about the quality of relevance and material, the relevance is very important because what you're submitting, what is it saying about this project? Is it a departure from this piece, that like what you're trying to do in this piece, in this project? Is it a departure from your original work, or is it in accordance with it? It's an example of an earlier attempt that you had at this particular sort of thing that you're trying to do. Let's say you're trying to work with this artistic practice, and here it is. Here's one more time that I tried to do it, or here's one more time that I wrote for a choir, or here's one more time that I wrote for a clarinet solo or something like that. So there has to be a connection. Either it shows that it shows your level of craft or technique, or it shows some form of a relevance to the project. So not everything you have will work for that project. You might have this amazing piano trio that just has nothing to do with the project. So make sure that you only submit things that are, that add to your application and not take away from it. Also quality, the sound quality. Not everything has to be studio recorded, of course, and not all videos have to be perfect. But if we hear another phone recorded video or audio file, it speaks volumes about your level of commitment to it. So I would probably consider either getting some basic gears and having them at your disposal. So even if you don't have a good archival recording of your work, you can re-record it, teach yourself how to edit it, mix it, whatever, or that you make sure that if you get a file from a performance, that you can spend some time with it and make it as best as it can be, because a low quality file can really damage your representation, because you're not there to talk about it. So that work is speaking on your behalf. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect and pristine. It just has to be audible enough that we can hear things clearly enough, right? So that's really important. The last part about support material, especially this is about time-related support materials such as an audio or video, is to, whenever possible, time code your material. Your piece might not start being awesome right off the bat, right? And if you don't mention anything about when and where they start listening and watching, they're going to go from the beginning. And they often have a limitation in terms of time. They might listen to only 5 minutes of it, right? They might not listen to the whole thing. So time code. So say, listen from 1 to 1:30 and then listen from 4 to 5, because those are the parts that A, are great, and B, make my application make more sense. So whenever, I think almost all grant applications allow for some form of time coding. Even if in your explanations of the support material, you can say, if possible, please listen from minute 3 to minute 4 and don't start from the beginning. And they always respect that wish. In fact, they're interested in seeing what you're trying to say with the support material. And if you think minute 3 to 4 is something that's going to make or break it, then that's what they're going to listen to. Especially because, again, they have time limitations. They only have, say, 5 to 10 minutes to spend on every application, and usually 5 minutes of it is spent listening to or watching the support material. Yeah, I think that's in terms of the support material. And then if your grant is successful, obviously you have to do a final report. I'm going to quickly go through this one. So this just basically you have to show an updated budget of how the money was spent. Certain costs probably changed. Some unforeseen costs came about. Some other costs probably were reduced. So you need to update that and send that in. You also need to mention what the challenges of the project was, how the money helped, and how the money sort of contributed to the fruition of the project. You also have to show some form of proof for the actual presentation of the project, whether it's a CD or whether it's a performance or whether it's whatever. There could be a score or a footage of the video or footage of the performance. And also they need some proof for the inclusion of their logo and acknowledgements. So when you get a grant, you need to make sure that on all platforms you're saying and you're mentioning that you got this grant from, let's say, the Manitoba Arts Council, right? And that includes having their logo and also either in a written form or verbal form, mentioning that their assistance was sort of very instrumental in making this project happen. Also, if it's possible in your project in any way, if you can have a verbal acknowledgement of that also would be very, very nice. And on social media, they love being tagged. All the arts councils, they absolutely love it, and they can't get enough of it. So whenever you're posting something, even in the process of making your project happen, tag them, thank them. They always love it, and they always sort of interact with it. And that will sort of amount to you sort of acknowledging their funding and their support, and that's part of the final report, basically. So make sure that on social media they're always mentioned, no matter what part of the process you're in. And make sure that you're keeping track of all the expenses and all expenditures and revenues and all that in a separate file rather than your budget form, just to sort of reduce your own headache, because especially in bigger projects, things can get really, really big really soon, right? So you need to make sure that you're keeping on top of everything and updating things as they need to be. And the really, really important thing here is that once you get a grant and you're doing the project, make sure that you get a receipt and you get an invoice for every single cost, right? Every single cost needs to be documented. Doesn't even matter if you bought like a coffee for your singer and it cost $2. It doesn't matter. If you want to claim that, that needs to have a receipt and needs to have a proof. It's very rare that councils ask for sort of audit you basically and ask for proof of the payments. But if they do, you need to be prepared, right? So you need to kind of be prepared for showing what you did and have evidence for it basically. It's not that ominous. They're very nice people. They're very, very nice people, and they always do their best to sort of accommodate everybody, and they don't want to cause you any headache, but they also need to make sure that their money that they're providing is going to all the right places and the right people and is being spent responsibly and ethically. So that kind of wraps things up in terms of the actual presentation. I had some sort of final thoughts that I want to share with you. It's nothing new. All these things we've talked about today. It's just sort of like based on my experience before. Always have a detail-oriented person proofread your work. Now, I myself, I'm a second language person. English is not my first language, and I make mistakes all the time, especially so. And I'm very lucky because my partner is a very, very meticulous person. She always proofreads my work and she always finds problems. This presentation went through her and she found so many things. So it's always important to have somebody else sort of look through your work and have their perspective on things, because something that might make sense to you might not make sense to them, or they might bring in a different idea. So proofreading, very, very important. Have somebody and prepare to buy them beer or coffee or whatever, and get their time to go through your text and make sure that everything makes sense, at least on some basic levels. As we talked about it, avoid rambling and organize your thoughts. No matter what you're doing, you got to make sure that what you're writing, especially in the larger text sections like the project description or your artist profile, that things are organized, right? Things are going through a particular flow and they're not just chaotic, right? There's a logic to it. That's very, very important. Please know that the jurors are also humans with a limited attention span, and write your grants with that in mind, generally speaking. I think that's that. So if you were on that jury and you had to read 50 other applications like that, would this application be a headache, or would this application be, oh, okay, this is very nice, this is very organized, right? That's important. That impression of sort of legibility of an application and accessibility of information really, really is a breath of fresh air. And if your application can be one of those, then you're already pretty good. If you have any confirmed source of a revenue, let's say you've applied for 5 grants, you're applying for the 6th one, and just a couple of weeks ago, one of them came back as confirmed, so you got $3,000. Make sure that you mention that in your current application that you're writing. That's very, very important. That shows that somebody already put in some seed sort of funding in your project. Somebody has had confidence in your project and in your vision. That really places you at a higher level for getting this grant that you're applying for, right? I mean, chances are if you got that grant, your application was strong, so you have a higher chance here too, but also to show that you already have something settled and secured is very, very, very important. Also highlight if another aspect of the project you're working on was previously funded by that council. Let's say, I'm applying for a recording grant from the Ontario Arts Council, and they also funded the commissioning of that piece that I'm recording, so that there's a continuity, right? They really like to see that too, that their money, that their funding and support is sort of carrying this artist through different forms of their artistic practice. So that's also something that you might want to mention. That's very, very important as well. The next point is don't be apologetic or pessimistic in your project. Don't let your tone sort of be of a negative sort of don't let your tone be negative. Basically, again, as artists, we're all inside. It's a chaos, right? It's constant struggling and doubt and all of those things and setbacks. So inside we might be feeling a lot of that turmoil, but don't let that come out as a pessimistic sort of way of looking at the world. So, you know, present yourself in the best of lights and present your even your struggles and even your endeavors and in the most positive lights possible. That's something that's really important in your grant writing, or generally just, you know, to present yourself as an artist. CV and headshot and bio always updated. Obviously, it goes without saying. Again, if I'm looking at somebody's CV and there hasn't been any activity since 2015, but they've been super active since 2015 because I know them personally, that dissonance can cause some trouble. Oftentimes, grant applications have a word limit. That word limit, it does not mean you necessarily have to finish it. So if there's a 2,000 character word limit or character limit, that doesn't mean you need to get to that 2,000. Sometimes you might get the point across in 200 words instead of like 500 words. Those are usually typically reserved for more complicated applications where you know, you have to explain a lot of things. And know the documents. We talked about this. Know the documents that you have to submit before you start applying. So certain documents might take time, like, you know, letters of support, letters of endorsement. If you need any form of licensing or any sort of things like that, that usually takes a lot of time. And if you're just pressed against the deadline, that's usually not fun. So make sure that you get everything settled and organized early on. Whether or not you get the grants, usually grants take anywhere from 2 to 4 months to get a response. Whether or not you get it, always call or email for feedback to know how your application, even if your application won, you got to know, because there might be something that you can improve in your future applications. Like really helps you sort of, it's the snowball effect, right? So if you know what something you did that didn't help, next time you can improve it. It's a very important thing. And now this you know, this last point is super important, because, you know, have a folder on your computer dedicated to grants, and just have a subfolder for every single application you have, you know, title it very clearly, and dump all the files and all the documents that are related to that particular grant on that folder. First of all, that will make your future applications 100 times faster, because everything is right there, instead of everything just being in this big downloads or documents folder where, you know, everything has the same title, right? Everything is sort of organized. And also, what for your final report, things are just so much, it's easier to find things. So, you know, that's just one of those experiential things that, you know, my grant application process was streamlined beyond description when I just created that folder and made sure that everything was in the right place. Really goes a long way. And before we go to the last point, I just want to include a really small note about Factor, because Factor is a little different than the other arts councils. As we said, Factor funds professional development for recording artists and also just recording projects. As opposed to the other arts councils that sort of focus more on and cultivating sort of artistic communal relationships and sort of groundbreaking innovations. Factor has a more sort of business-oriented outlook on projects. So they look at things a little bit more like an investment, as opposed to, let's say, a project that, you know, a recording project that's going to be very artistically fulfilling or interesting. They want to see how it's going to have returns in terms of their investment. So when you're writing a grant for Factor, it's a very different process. You don't have to submit a whole lot of documents, but the most important document you're going to send for Factor is your marketing plan. That needs to be very detailed in terms of who's doing what your exact marketing plan is, who's your publicist, who's, you know, what your levels of marketing is from the ground up. Factor doesn't I don't want to make it sound like they just care about money. That's not true. They fund some amazing projects, but their outlook is slightly more business oriented than the other councils, and that sort of, you have to have that in mind as you're writing it. Chances are you're working with a label, and the label will be very sort of well acquainted with with how factor grants work, and they will be able to provide you with a marketing plan that's detailed enough. But that just want to include that right away, so that it's not very so we know the distinction between the two. I just want to dive into a couple of case studies of just some random projects and how we can sort of go about funding for them. But if Massimo, if there are other questions, I'd be happy to take them, and then we can dive into this one.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, that would be great. So another question we had from someone: is there a recommended language to use in the context of grant writing? And this may include vocabulary, sayings, and ways to frame your goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like what we talked about, you want the language, not necessarily. Well, first of all, you want the language to be, you want your writing to be very formal. So that just goes with any sort of proposal writing, that you want your language to be formal, error-free as much as possible. You don't want to have run-on sentences. But if to say that there's like particular terminology that you want to use or anything like that, I don't think that's necessarily the case. In there are general concepts that we talked about that are really important. For instance, in your impact section, if you want to talk about how you're changing, how you're reaching communities, how you're reaching beyond your normal sort of fan base, or how it's impacting you as a how your project's impacting you as an artist, and how your growth as an artist. So these sorts of things, but I don't think there are any particular expressions that would sort of be taking the medal home. It's just formal, error-free, clear, and yeah. I think that's about it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And another question: some of the grants ask for the strategies for measuring impact. Do you have any suggestions?
That's very tricky, and that's absolutely true that they ask for how you're so measuring it, which is how are you going to measure this? But what you can do, again, you can bring in examples of, for example, if it's about communal impact, which communities you're impacting, or if there are particular people in your team that are from different ethnic or sort of other groups, and then they're each going to take this project to their groups and the communities and expose them to it. So that's another way of kind of measuring it, because you're giving more concrete examples. Another thing is you can bring in examples from your aspirations from your artist profile to say, well, I want to make sure that I am, I have works performed in Europe by the year of 2025, and this project will help me get there because I will be able to have a premiere in Europe. So something that ties in with your artist profile would be able to help. But beyond that, that's a usually very tricky question. But that's a good way of going about it, especially if people in your teams that have access to different communities. That can be really, really helpful to say, well, each of them can bring in different people and bring in different ears and eyes to the project and expose it, and potentially have a mutual sort of impact on both me as an artist and the community.
Thank you very much for that response. And we have one more question.
Yeah.
Recently, some grants ask for short videos made by the artist describing the project.
Right.
Do you have any experience with that or any suggestions?
I hate those. I hate, because it's just, first of all, not everybody has access to a well-lit room or a good camera or a good microphone, as we talked about it, right? So that already poses a challenge for a lot of people. I know a lot of competitions ask for it. My experience was with I think a couple of composition competitions that I did in the past 2 years that I had to submit a video, and it's usually very short. I don't I don't babble on too much. I just kind of get to the point, thank them for their time. I usually smile a lot, try it, even though I don't really smile a whole lot, generally speaking, and sort of try to be, because you're sort of putting a face to your proposal and you're putting your voice to your proposal, I try to be usually very honest and transparent. and sort of speak from the heart. Basically, that's what I'm saying. Not too much from the heart. Don't be too like lovey-dovey, but just sort of be more vulnerable in terms of what your project means to you and how it can elevate you as a person and as an artist, and how it can elevate your community. And I think when it comes from that place, because hopefully you've already explained everything very succinctly in your application, everything is in the right place. So they kind of just want to see your face and see what you have to say. And I think having that tone, that transparent, honest, vulnerable tone, that this project means a lot to me because of such and such, and it means a lot to my community because of such and such, can really seal the deal. So I would say that's probably the best strategy, to have that sort of tone, that sort of vulnerable, very, very honest tone. People will connect to that immediately, I think.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we also have a comment from
Sure.
someone who said you made an excellent presentation. So.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Oh, we got one more question just
Sure,
now.
absolutely.
So after talking with a grant agent, someone was advised to reach out to concert series or festival organizers who could possibly support their project and give it more credibility and a better feasibility rating. Mm-hmm. What's your advice in cold calling such organizers?
No, I think that kind of goes beyond this presentation. It's a very mixed experience, sort of calling an organization that you have sort of no ties to. And I'm not exactly sure what that particular application or applicant was trying to do, that they were advised to do this. I really wouldn't know, because I would have to know the specifics of exactly why. But my experience with cold calling organizations has been extremely mixed, because sometimes you get really, really good responses from people and they're interested in knowing your work and knowing what you do, even if they don't necessarily collaborate with you. And sometimes it's just, absolute white noise, nothing. So it's tricky. But again, I'm not sure what that particular project or applicant was trying to do that they were advised. But they were told that would help their future sort of presentations or proposals if they had some sort of support from the artistic community, which is again something we all sort of it's a difficult path, and it's a challenge for all of us to have that. But without knowing more about the project, I would be able to provide more detail.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, I think we can go on with the.
Yeah. So okay. So in the case study, I just wanted to kind of have 4 examples of random projects that we might come across and how we're going to fund them. So let's say you're a composer or you're a producer and you want to put together an opera, and you want to go from all the way from the scratch, from absolute nothing to the presentation of the work, and even maybe the recording it or whatever. So to write the text and to write the music and to rehearse it, workshop it, hiring all the people. So this would be a very, very, for example, very lavish and very expensive project, right? So if you went to the at the Canada Council for the Arts and asked for a concept to realization grant, you could probably get, if not all, probably the majority of your costs covered, because those grants are all encompassing, so they cover everything. Let's say for some reason you decide not to go that route. And again, I'm going to give examples from my province, which is the province of Ontario. It's probably similar to other programs and other councils. So I would probably go for what we call a presenter-producer grant for the Ontario Arts Council. I'm sure there are other types in other sort of provincial councils that helps you with workshopping, rehearsing, and performing the whatever work. It does not cover any commissioning costs. So you can also apply for commissioning or creation costs for creation grants at either your local municipal council or Canada Council for the Arts, for example. For things like text creation, you can also apply for Canada Council. That would be part of the bigger grant, or you can also apply for the literary sections of the councils in your municipal or provincial levels. So this would be a very big project, for instance. This needs a lot of moving parts. But thankfully, we have the Canada Council that offers sort of a one-stop shop for all your costs. And that's usually very, very helpful. Another example is a recording project where, you know, the composer, the performer, and the label are all in different countries and provinces. So this is complicated because, you know, every provincial grant application would need at least a part of the team and crew to be based in that region. So let's say if your label is in Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia Arts isn't going to give everybody money because the recording is happening, let's say, in Montreal, right? So then you would have to sort of apply to each, based on the activity that's happening in each location, you would have to apply for that activity from that arts council. So that would make things very complicated. Again, you can apply for the Canada Council for the Arts. They're concept to realization grants, and just because that's, you know, it covers all parts of Canada. And what else was I going to say? Oh, and there's also some touring and traveling involved as well. Now, touring and traveling is something that's oftentimes only covered by the Canada Council. I'm not sure if other provincial councils cover it, but Ontario and Toronto, for instance, where I live, don't. It's just through Canada Council for the Arts. Factor also has some touring and traveling money that they usually put up, but only for projects they've already funded. So not just randomly for a project that Canada Council does. So that's that. Let's say the third example is a nonprofit arts organization that wants to, you know, have an overhaul, make things better, more efficient, hire a marketing team, hire staff, hire a space. So this would be one of those examples that administrative grants can come in. Canada Council has a lot of that. Factor also for recording, for example, for recording studios and labels, has a lot of comprehensive grants that they provide that helps with general operation. Operation grants are also from Canada Council or from your provincial councils are really good if you want to spend that money for programming, your music or your artistic activities, your season, for example, or if you want to, you know, for other costs like staff, space, venue, all of that. So that can also be put as in the operation grants that all of the federal and provincial and municipal councils provide. And the last one, sort of a less complicated example, is like, let's say a new graduate student in composition wants to go to Europe and attend the summer residency in somewhere in Europe, in France or something. So that would be very simple. So you can apply for either a travel grant from the Canada Council, or you can apply for a professional development grant. For example, SOCAN would be one of those places where you can apply. They don't give that much money. They only give like $1,200 per person per year. So it's not a whole lot of money, but it's one of the resources. Or you can apply to, let's say, Ontario Arts Council, professional development, the Chalmers, for example. Chalmers grant would be really good for this. It's for sort of up and coming emerging artists to sort of go out and sort of live a life and explore things and experience things. So I would say professional development grant from any of them, or maybe a travel grant if it's a shorter, sort of more compact residency, a few days versus a few months. So, you know, just want to thank everybody for joining me. Again, I know that is a lot of information. It's very compact, and I've been just talking your head off for the past hour and 20 minutes. But as I said, grant writing is not in any way a daunting task. It can get easier, and with a little bit of organization, a little bit of practice, you can actually get quite good at it, and you know, make sure you can sort of rely on it as a more or less reliable source of income and funding for your projects, which is something that we really take for granted in Canada. Again, I don't consider myself sort of the final stop in this exploration. So you can definitely talk to other people, talk to grant writers or people out there who actually make a living from writing grants. Talk to, you know, your grant officers and learn more about things, and go through these guidelines of these grants and try to learn as much as you can. And I'm sure that it'll be a fun experience for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saman. I'm just gonna close things up. I will be posting some links. So thank you once again, Saman, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Saman, for all of your valuable insight, and for everyone for attending this. I just wanted to inform everyone that we will be switching to a monthly webinar rather than a weekly one going forward. and the next one will be announced soon, so stay tuned for that. If you would like to learn more information about Saman, his work and his music, you can visit his website at samanshahimusic.com. I will just be sharing that in the Zoom chat right now. And regarding questions about the availability of the PowerPoint presentation, Saman said he would share the PDF, but it will also be available at the following link, which I'll post in the Zoom chat in a few days. I'm just posting that right now. And lastly, just for those who are not members of the CLC yet and who are interested in becoming a member, you can apply through the online registration form on the Become a Member page under the Join Us tab for our website. And I will share the link to that in the chat as well. And just to remind people of just benefits, membership benefits include being notified about upcoming events and opportunities, being allowed to take part in professional development workshops, being granted access to information regarding commissioning rates and model contracts, and having your voice heard on a wide range of issues. And lastly, in turn, your membership is our greatest strength, and it gives both us, an organization, and you credibility with funders, which is especially important at the moment, given the precarious situation in which many musicians and arts organizations currently find themselves during this pandemic. Thank you very much, everyone. Please take care. And
and thank you for having me. Thanks to CLC for having me. This was great. Thanks everybody. Stay safe.
Stay safe, everyone. Take care. Bye.